lost fortunes, deceived investors. Scandal. A Ponzi scheme is one of the most infamous types of fraud. It tricks early investors by paying them with money from later investors, making a fake business appear legitimate. But Ponzi schemes began as something far more complex. Their origins are as sinister as their creator. This is the story of Charles Ponzi, a master con artist. Charles Ponzi was born Carlo Pietro Giovanni Guglielmo Tebaldo Ponzi on March 3, 1882, in Lugo, northern Italy. His parents, Oreste and Imelda Ponzi, Ponzi later said, were part of a wealthy Italian family that had become borderline poor by the time he was born. His early years were marked by modest means and economic challenges typical of late 19th century Italy. Ponzi's family struggled financially, and his early experiences shaped his ambition to seek opportunities beyond the constraints of his homeland. Ponzi is said to have expressed criminal tendencies early on, stealing from his parents and even parish priests. Ponzi attended Sapienza University in Rome in his younger years, where he was much less than a model student.
After 4 long years, he was forced to leave with no money and no degree.
In my college days, I was what you would call here a spendthrift, Ponzi told the New York Times. That is, I had arrived at the precarious period in a young man's life when spending money seemed the most attractive thing on earth. During his time at school, however, he had heard stories of Italians going off to America to find fortune and freedom, and decided this was his only option. At the ripe age of 21, Ponzi embarked on a journey to the United States. He arrived in Boston in November of 1902 aboard the SS Vancouver, with nothing but dreams and hope.
In his autobiography, The Rise of Mr. Ponzi, he claims he left Italy with only $200 and had already spent most of it by the time he made it to Boston,
arriving with only $2.50 to his name. In Boston, Ponzi initially struggled to find his footing. He first learned English and took on menial jobs to support himself, including working as a dishwasher, waiter, grocery clerk, and sewing machine repairman. He didn't last long at most of them. Usually, he quit or was fired pretty early on, including a few firings for theft or shortchanging customers. Ponzi moved often in his search for work. He jumped from Pittsburgh to New York, to New Haven to Providence, until finally, he crossed the border north and ended up in Montreal, Canada. Here he secured a job as a bank teller, but as luck would have it, the bank went under soon after he was hired. He was back in the job market once again. After leaving the bank, Ponzi hit the streets of crime again. And after an unfortunate case of forgery, he spent 3 years in prison in Quebec. But that didn't stop him, as you probably could have guessed. Once he was released from prison, Ponzi found interest in yet another business venture, this time smuggling immigrants to the US from Italy. And yet again, he was caught and thrown into a prison in Atlanta for 2 more years. Fast forward to 1917, Ponzi was back in Boston for Memorial Day weekend. Now 35 years old, still struggling. It was here he met a lady named Rose Necco, and in February 1918, the two were married. For the next few months, Ponzi worked at several jobs, an import-export company, and his wife's family's fruit company, which failed shortly after. In 1919, Ponzi had set up a small export-import business that he thought might finally be his road to riches.
He was on the job one day when he received a letter from a Spanish company requesting an advertising catalog. Inside the envelope, he found an international reply coupon, or an IRC. These coupons were used for purchasing postage stamps at a discounted rate in one country and redeeming them for full postage in another. Ponzi took only a moment to think about how he could exploit this practice. There was money-making potential if one could take advantage of exchange rate differences to buy IRCs in one country and redeem them in another. What Ponzi had really discovered was actually just arbitrage, or the simultaneous purchase and sale of an asset in 2 different markets. The smallest differences in price allowed for a modest profit, and if he could do it at scale, buying IRCs in Italy and selling them in the US for more, he could have made decent money. This is legal in the US, and even encouraged as it improves market efficiency. If Ponzi had taken this idea and stopped here, he could have been a free rich man.
In 1920, Ponzi organized a company called Securities Exchange Company, in which he sold stock advertising 50% interest after 90 days. He told investors their money would be used to purchase IRCs in Italy that could be redeemed in the US. Instead, Ponzi used the funds from new investors to pay off old investors. In the first 8 months of 1920, he raked in a whopping $15 million, $220 million in today's dollars. He kept the scheme going by telling investors he had created an elaborate network of agents, buying IRCs for him overseas, that he could redeem in the US for a tidy profit. In fact, there was no elaborate network of coupon buyers. He was using new investments to pay off old investors. Ponzi hired agents and paid them a generous penny to find new investors in New England and New Jersey at the time. Ponzi began depositing his money at the Hanover Trust Bank of Boston, a small bank on Hanover Street in the mostly Italian North End. His hope was that once his account was large enough, he would be able to impose his will on the bank, or maybe even be made president of it one day. Ponzi even bought a controlling interest in the bank through himself and several friends after depositing just about $3 million. Ponzi's investors adored him. His initial investors were typically working-class immigrants like himself. But as news of his business spread, well-to-do Boston Brahmins wanted a piece as well. In its heyday, nearly 75% of Boston's police force had invested in the scheme. He had young boys investing newspaper dollars to very, very high net worth individuals. Many of his investors had been able to mortgage homes and invest in their life savings since working with him. Some of them just reinvested their profits with him time and time again. Now, Ponzi had branches spanning from Maine to New Jersey. Even though Ponzi was bringing in plenty of money every day, it was clear to anyone who looked at the numbers that this company of his was running at a loss. As long as money kept flowing in, existing investors could be paid with the new money. This was the only method Ponzi had to continue providing returns to existing investors, as he made no effort to generate legitimate profits. He hadn't figured out a way to actually change the IRCs to cash yet, and subsequently realized that changing the coupons to money was logistically impossible. For the number of investors he had at this point, Ponzi would have needed Titanic-sized ships filled to the brim with postal coupons just to ship them from Europe to the US. However, Ponzi was paid through interest payment, and so he lived what most would agree is a lavish life. He bought a mansion in Massachusetts and maintained several bank accounts across New England, besides Hanover Trust. He bought a locomobile, the finest car of that time. He bought 2 first-class tickets to Italy for a honeymoon with Rose, but instead decided to change them to bring his mother to the US from Italy in a first-class stateroom on an ocean liner. After his mother passed, Ponzi told his father, the director of an Italian children's home in Jamaica Plain, that he would donate $10,000 in her name. Ponzi also bought a macaroni company and part of a wine company in an attempt to gain profits that could be used to repay the investors of his IRC scheme. It's obvious that at some point in his scheme, Ponzi would raise suspicion from someone. He seemed to ward many off for some time, but naturally people eventually started to dig. When a Boston financial writer suggested there was no way he could legitimately return such payments in such a short amount of time, Ponzi sued for libel and actually won $500,000 in damages. Nonetheless, there were signs his downfall was approaching. Joseph Daniels, a Boston furniture dealer, sued Ponzi after selling him furniture he couldn't afford. The lawsuit was unsuccessful, but it opened the eyes of many to how Ponzi could have gone from a penniless fraudster to a successful millionaire in a matter of a few years. Some investors decided to pull all their money from the Securities Exchange Company, which could have been the end of it all. But Ponzi paid them to keep from losing all his invested fortunes.
On July 24, 1920, the Boston Post printed a favorable article on Ponzi. At this point, Ponzi was making an unimaginable $250,000 a day, and this just went up after the article was printed.
which implied Ponzi was actually able to pay back 50% interest in just 90 mere days to his investors.
This was at a time when banks were paying just 5% interest a year. The next business day after this article was published, Ponzi arrived at his office to find thousands of Bostonians waiting to give him their money. But suspicion was still growing. Richard Grozier of the Post and city editor Eddie Dunn were assigned investigative reporters to look into Ponzi. At this time, he was also under investigation by Massachusetts authorities, and on the day the Post printed its article, Ponzi met with state officials. To divert the officials from checking his books, he offered to stop taking money during the investigation, which was really his only choice, since no proper books were being kept anyways. The state officials' suspicions were temporarily calmed. In the meantime, publicist William McMasters had been hired by Ponzi, but even he became suspicious of Ponzi after some time. He later described Ponzi as a financial idiot who did not seem to know how to add. McMaster eventually found several highly incriminating documents that indicated Ponzi was robbing Peter to pay Paul, a saying now synonymous with Ponzi schemes. McMasters went to Grozier, his former employer, with this information. Grozier offered him $5,000 for his story, which was printed in the Post on August 2nd, 1920. McMaster declared Ponzi hopelessly insolvent, reporting that while he claimed $7 million in liquid funds, he was actually at least $2 million in debt. The story touched off a massive run, and Ponzi paid off in one day. He then sped up plans to build a massive conglomerate that would engage in banking and import-export operations. With Ponzi's fallout in full swing, commissioners were concerned that withdrawals from his bank reserves could bring Boston's banking system to its knees.
This was only worsened when it was discovered that Ponzi had more than $250,000 in loans from Hanover Trust.
This led Allen to speculate that Ponzi was not nearly as well-financed as he claimed, since he was getting large loans from the bank he effectively controlled. He ordered 2 bank examiners to keep an eye on Ponzi's accounts. On August 9th, bank examiners reported that Ponzi's accounts were overdrawn, and Hanover was ordered not to pay out any more checks from his main account. State officials then invited Ponzi note holders to come to the Massachusetts State House to furnish their names and addresses for the purpose of the investigation. On the same day, Ponzi received a preview of Pride's audit, which revealed Ponzi was at least $7 million in debt. With rumors surfacing that Ponzi was about to be arrested any day now, he surrendered to authorities. He was charged with mail fraud for sending letters to his marks, telling them their notes had matured. Ponzi was released on $25,000 bail, but immediately rearrested on state charges of larceny, for which he posted an additional $10,000 bond. Investors were wiped out, receiving less than 30 cents to the dollar, and in total, they lost about $20 million, $230 million today. In 2 federal indictments, Ponzi was charged with 86 counts of mail fraud and faced life imprisonment. He pled guilty to just 1 count at the urgent pleading of his wife. Ponzi was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. In Massachusetts, however, Ponzi was released after 3.5 years and was indicted on 22 state charges of larceny. This came as a surprise to Ponzi, who thought he had a deal with the state to drop his charges if he pled guilty to the federal ones. He sued, claiming he was facing double jeopardy, and his case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. But it was decided that federal plea bargains had no say over state cases. In October 1922, Ponzi was tried on the first 10 larceny counts. Since he was insolvent, Ponzi served as his own attorney and, speaking as persuasively as he had with his duped investors, was acquitted by the jury on all charges. At a third trial, Ponzi was found guilty and was sentenced to an additional 7 to 9 years as a common thief. There were even efforts to have him deported in 1922. In 2 federal indictments, Ponzi was charged with 86 counts of mail fraud and faced life imprisonment. The Ponzi scheme left a lasting legacy on financial markets and regulatory practices. It prompted reforms to protect investors and detect fraudulent schemes. As you probably already know, the term Ponzi scheme is now used to describe any scam that pays returns to investors using their own money or money from new investors instead of actual profits. Unsurprisingly, Charles Ponzi was not the first person to conduct a scheme in this manner. However, his case was, and still is, one of the most infamous, causing the term to be named after him, even in current times. Ponzi schemes remind us of the risks of chasing quick wealth and the need to do proper research before investing. The downfall of Ponzi schemes has led to stricter financial regulations to prevent similar scams and protect investors. Charles Ponzi's story is more than just financial fraud. It's a tale of ambition and the desire for prosperity. Charles Ponzi's name is now linked with financial fraud, but his story goes beyond that. It reminds us of the important lessons learned from one of history's most infamous schemes.